It says, "Wherever your path leads, you'll take a small part of us with you." First Unitarian Church, Albuquerque, New Mexico, December 7, 2003. And indeed, I have taken you with me. This stole that was presented to me at the end of my internship, evocative, as you can tell, of your mural, with the chalice representing Unitarian Universalism, the identity that I have had for my whole life, and the lotus blossom representing Buddhism, which at that time was a brand new identity for me. I have worn this stole in El Paso and Midland, Texas, in Gainesville, Florida, and where I also did some consulting ministries in Tarpon Springs, Florida, and Marion County. And now, from time to time, I wear it in White Plains, New York. When Laura Kim and I arrived here on Friday, I began to realize how much I really like this place. And I began to remember that I haven't seen Albuquerque since my internship ended, except for binge watching Breaking Bad. And that's not really the same. A long, strange trip, and I have had some things to work on along the way. In 2003, I was a 44-year-old ministerial internship preparing for a second career as a minister. The first career, teaching philosophy, had been fun, but I was looking for something where I wouldn't have to grade your papers. And now I'm 58. A lot happens in 14 years. This place is different. I'm different. A lot of you were not part of this church 14 years ago. If you raised your hand when Christine asked if you remembered my internship year, thank you for being a part of this congregation that was so transformative and such a blessing for me. And if you didn't raise your hand because you're new here, thank you for bringing your soul and your energy to keep this place that means so much to so many, vital and growing. I had a lot of work to do during my internship with you, and I've had a lot to work on since. One of my projects was essentially assigned to me by an entity known as the Midwest Regional Subcommittee on Candidacy. The path to professional ministry is gaily strewn with committees. Shortly before beginning the internship, while I was a divinity student, I had been to see this Midwest Regional Subcommittee on Candidacy, and their job was to determine whether my aspirations to be a minister should be encouraged or discouraged. One of their questions was, "Do you have a spiritual practice?" Before starting seminary, I had spent 2 years as a congregational facilitator and preacher for the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Clarksville, Tennessee. Before that, I'd served as a president of our fellowship in Waco, Texas, as vice president of our church in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'd worked as a church secretary for a year at our Nashville, Tennessee church. But did I have a spiritual practice? I was a born and raised Unitarian Universalist. I had a PhD. I'd been a university professor of philosophy for 4 years. I could debate about metaphysics, metaethics, metatheology, post-structuralism, post-industrialism, and postmodernism. If it was meta or post, I was all over it. But did I have a spiritual practice? Well, no, I didn't. Get a spiritual practice, the committee told me. As the firstborn child of rationalist, humanist, academic parents who had grown up and gone into the family business, being a rationalist humanist academic. The notion of spiritual practice came late in life to me. I declared myself an atheist in the 4th grade. I declared this at my elementary school, and a shockwave of scandal rippled through the school. I declared this at my UU Sunday school, and no one seemed to care. And I wasn't even one of these modern spiritual atheists exemplified in today's reading. No, as a child and teenager and on into graduate school, I was the old-fashioned kind of atheist. I didn't go for spirituality, did not use that word for my experiences, nor did I think in terms of sacred, divine, transcendent. Wasn't so keen on awe, mystery, or wonder either. But the inchoate sense that something I could not name was missing from my life had begun to grow. And by the time the Midwest Regional Subcommittee on Candidacy spake unto me, I was ready to take their instruction to heart. I would do this spiritual practice thing. And so when I showed up here, almost 15 years ago, I had that to work on. I had a number of other things to also work on, but that's one I'm still working on. And as a preacher, lo these years now, my mind has been recurrently engaged with the question of how to explain spirituality to Unitarian Universalists. I have noticed that a lot more of us need a lot less explaining about this than, say, my parents' generation did, or for that matter, than I did 15 years ago. But just in case I'm not the only one here still working on this, let me offer what I got. In other words, what I want to tell you this morning is how I learned to stop worrying and love spirituality. You might remember Stanley Kubrick's 1964 movie, Dr. Strangelove, with the subtitle, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And spirituality actually is sometimes like a bomb, or rather, life sometimes is like a bomb, and spirituality is about being present to it and loving even that. The world as we know it can blow up at any moment. The loss of a loved one, traumatic tragedy. And life also explodes in beauty. The birth of a child, the arrival of spring, an act of kindness. How can one learn to stop worrying and love the bombs we have feared? How do we stop worrying and love everything, even the hard parts? It calls for such virtues as equanimity and compassion, and those, I can tell you, are spiritual virtues. And even if they are entirely a matter of neurons being wired a certain way, the circuitry of spirituality draws on but is different from purely cognitive intelligence, draws on but is different from the emotional circuitry. Native disposition, genetics, accounts for some of a person's spiritual virtue. Can you cultivate the spiritual virtues beyond your native disposition? Well, sort of. Spirituality encompasses transcendent love, inner peace, all rightness, acceptance, awe, beauty, wonder, humility, gratitude, a freshness of experience, a feeling of plenitude, abundance, and a deep simplicity of all things. A feeling that Sigmund Freud called the oceanic feeling, a sense of indissoluble union with the great all, of belonging to the universal. In moments of heightened spiritual experience, the gap between self and world vanishes. The normal experience of time leaves us, and each moment has a quality of the eternal to it. Symptoms of developing spirituality include increased tendency to let things happen rather than make them happen, more frequent attacks of smiling from the heart, more frequent feelings of being connected with others and with nature, more frequent episodes of overwhelming appreciation. Decisions flow more from intention or spontaneity and less from fears based on past experience. A greater ability to enjoy each moment, decreased worrying, decreased interest in conflict, in interpreting the actions of others, in judging others, and in judging self. Increased non-judgmental curiosity, increased capacity to love without expecting anything in return, increased receptivity to kindness offered, and increased interest in extending kindness to others. A capacity sometimes to transcend the ego defense mechanisms by which most of us spend most of our lives governed. As I pursued this work, my scholarly bent did not disappear, so I was intrigued to learn about the work of psychologist Robert Cloninger, who sought a way to define spirituality more definitely, empirically, and measurably. He developed a 240-item questionnaire called the Temperament and Character Inventory, which includes spirituality. He calls it self-transcendence as one of the dimensions of character. As Cloninger measures it, spirituality is the sum of three subscales: self-forgetfulness, transpersonal identification, and acceptance. First, self-forgetfulness. This is the proclivity for becoming so immersed in an activity that the boundary between self and others seems to fall away. Whether the activity is sports, painting, playing a musical instrument, we might sometimes lose ourselves in it, and the sense of being a separate, independent self takes a vacation. Second, transpersonal identification. This is recognizing oneself in others and others in oneself. If you've ever found yourself looking at another person or another being with a feeling that you are that other, their body embodies you, or if you've looked at yourself with a sense that your being embodies others, then you've experienced transpersonal identification. Spirituality involves connecting with the world's suffering and apprehending that suffering as your very own. Transpersonal identification is going beyond that step that says, "There but for the grace of God go I." It's not that grace saves you from the unfortunate circumstances of others. Nothing saves you, because in fact you are not saved from those circumstances. If anyone is hungry or hurting, then you are hungry and hurting, for the suffering are you. That's transpersonal identification. And third, acceptance. This is the ability to accept and affirm reality just as it is, even the hard parts, even the painful and tragic parts. Spiritually mature people are in touch with the suffering of the world, yet also and simultaneously feel joy in that connection. Acceptance doesn't mean complacency about oppression, injustice, and harm. Indeed, the spiritually mature are also often the most active and most effective in working for peace and social justice. They're energized to sustain that work because they can accept reality just as it is, even as they work to change it. Because they find joy in each present moment, they avoid the recrimination and blame, seeing that blame merely recapitulates the very reactivity that's at the root of oppression. So, add together your scores for self-forgetfulness, transpersonal identification, and acceptance, and the sum is your spirituality score, neatly quantified for you by Dr. Robert Cloninger. Here's a thing, though. It's not a matter of will. It's not a matter of volition It's not a matter of weighing the pros and cons and making a decision. You can't decide to be more spiritual or more spiritually mature, at least not in a moment. If you are low in spirituality, that is, as Cloninger finds, you are practical, self-conscious, materialistic, controlling, characterized by rational objectivity and material success, you can't wake up one morning and decide you're no longer going to be that way. It's who you are. And your own rational objectivity will very sensibly point out to you that you don't even know what it would mean not to be that way. What you can decide, what is a matter of will and volition, is whether to take up a certain kind of discipline called a spiritual practice and just see where that takes you. I know that these days all kinds of things get called a spiritual practice. Since the days when this spiritual practice thing started getting enough attention that Unitarian subcommittees would ask ministerial aspirants about it, I have heard all kinds of things called a spiritual practice. I heard one UU say that the way she got dressed in the morning was her spiritual practice. When I was your intern, Christine once gave me a small gift, a button that said, "Book buying is a spiritual practice," which was gratifying because I do like to buy books. And I'm not saying that those things can't be spiritual practices, but I do believe we're missing something crucial if we fail to distinguish between a spiritual practice and just something that we do. Quilting or piano playing or hiking might or might not qualify as a spiritual practice. That is, might or might not tend to produce the symptoms of developing spirituality. An activity is more likely to work as a spiritual practice if you seriously treat it as one. And in order to do that, first, engage the activity with mindfulness, focusing on the activity as you do it, with a sharp awareness of each present moment. Second, engage the activity with intention to thereby cultivate spiritual development, reflecting as you do the activity, or just before or just after you do it, on your intention to manifest those symptoms of spiritual development in your life. And third, sometimes engage the activity with a group of others who expressly gather to do that activity in a way that the group intentionally is doing to cultivate spirituality, to share each other's and share each other's spiritual reflections before, during, or after doing the activity together. And last and most, it requires establishing a foundation of spiritual openness. And I found that there are 3 basic practices for everyone, whatever your individual identified spiritual practice might be, that can help grow that into a real thing. Silence. 15 minutes a day, I would say, of being still and quiet and just bringing attention to your own amazing breathing. Journaling. 15 minutes a day of writing about your gratitudes, your highest hopes, your experiences of awe. And study. 15 minutes a day studying wisdom literature, the essays of Pema Chodron or Thomas Merton, the poems of Rumi or Mary Oliver, or the Tao Te Ching or the Bible's Book of Psalms, just to mention a very few examples of wisdom literature. With these 3 daily practices building your foundation of spiritual awareness, then gardening or yoga or throwing pottery are much better positioned to truly be spiritual practices for you. So, suppose you got serious about maintaining a spiritual discipline. You engage your practice daily. You do it mindfully, you do it with intention to cultivate compassion and connection and non-judgmental curiosity, self-forgetfulness, transpersonal identification, and acceptance. You get together regularly with a group that helps you maintain and explore the spiritual focus of your practice, and you develop your base with daily silence, journaling, and study. What then? What will happen? if you do everything to ensure that your practice is a true bona fide spiritual practice, and you do that spiritual practice long enough, every day for a year, or 10 years, or 30 years, will you then exude equanimity and compassion, while unperturbable calm, inner peace, and beauty continuously manifest as you gracefully, lovingly flow through your life? Maybe. It could happen. No guarantees, though. Spirituality, as I mentioned, is not a matter of will, and strong muscles aren't either. That is, you can't decide to just, I'm going to go bench press 500 pounds. I'm really determined to do it, and then go do it. But at least with muscles, there's a fairly predictable timeline by which exercise increases strength. If you have a normal physiology and you adopt a regimen of exercise and stick with it, you will get stronger. There's a kind of a fairly smooth curve by which you'll progress toward the limit to which that regimen can take you. It's spiritual strengthening doesn't work like that. It's not a reliable product of putting in the time doing the exercise. The Spirit has its own schedule. Committed, serious spiritual practitioners can go for years when their practice just feels dry and void and useless. And then they can hit a patch where they actually seem to be regressing. And they find that their acting is cranky, unkind, disconnected, as withdrawn, maybe on one hand, or as controlling on the other hand, as they ever had before they started a spiritual practice. There is no smooth curve of progress. I started my spiritual practice for the worst possible reason, because an authority told me to. The Midwest Regional Subcommittee on Candidacy decreed, and I set out to comply. It's contradictory to take up a path of self-acceptance and trusting in your own inner wisdom because an outside authority told you to. But that's what I did. It's contradictory to judge myself for judging myself too much. And yet that's what I did and still do, albeit somewhat more gently, usually. I've now had a chance to talk with a number of people on a path of spiritual practice, serious path, and all of us, or so it seems, began as I did, in some kind of contradiction. We felt broken, wrong, inadequate, and we thought spiritual practice would fix us. But spiritual practice isn't about fixing anything, which is why there's no smooth curve toward becoming fixed. Spiritual practice, spiritual awakening, is about realizing that we aren't broke and don't need fixing. It's hard to really believe that we're not broke, we don't need fixing, never have been from the beginning. Our culture constantly tells us we aren't good enough. Get better. Buy this product, this treatment, this school, this exercise, this method. Spirituality is about remembering the fact of abundance in the midst of the daily barrage of messages of scarcity. Will recognition of abundance happen if you do the practice? I can tell you there are more ups and downs than the most volatile stock market. But over the long haul, probably, yes. If you love just doing the practice, and you do it because it's who you are, and not with any idea that you're gaining something from it. If judgment about gain and loss, progress and regress falls away, and there's just you, loving who you are, loving the way you and the whole universe manifest in and through your practice, then, yeah, the fact of abundance is thus wise by that very fact clearer to you. Speaking of Dr. Strangelove, at the end of that movie, the bomber plane is set to release its nuclear payload, which will set off a nuclear conflagration to end civilization. But the release mechanism jams. Slim Pickens climbs down into the bomb bay to fix the jam. He succeeds, and the bomb is released, while he's still sitting on it. In the film's most memorable shot at the end, Slim Pickens is waving his cowboy hat and whooping as he rides the bomb down to his and what will ultimately be the planet's destruction. Woo-hoo! Well, maybe that's what learning to stop worrying and love the bomb looks like. He does seem to be living in the moment. I first saw that as a teenager, and that was such a striking scene for me, because I knew if I were falling out of the sky riding on a nuclear bomb, I'd be freaked out in fear and despair. My God, my God, my God, I've got maybe 1 minute to live. But look at what Slim Pickens is doing with his 1 minute. Woo-hoo! All of us are riding that bomb. Our time is so short before life blows up on us. Really being here for it is what I've been working on. I recommend it. Amen.